The world is looking a lot like 1914 again. Now, I'm not saying that everything that played out then is going to play out here again and that World War III is just around the corner, but this video isn't clickbait either. I'm making this video to explain to you why I believe there are many similarities between what is happening today and what happened back then, and what this period can teach us about our modern, messy geopolitics. Why the great power rivalries of the time reflect our own. Why the logic of that period when it comes to geopolitics is coming back into fashion. I think it's important to note straight off the bat that our modern geopolitics is quite messy. We have wars going on, enemies are now allies, allies are now enemies, and in general there seems to be a great shift in our geopolitics and our understanding of international relations. I think Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, best summed it up at his speech at the World Economic Forum.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself.
What Carney is actually touching up in his speech is a fundamental discourse in the study of international relations, that between the ideologies of liberalism versus realism. These two ideologies have constantly been at odds with each other in trying to understand international relations, and they both present two separate understandings of world politics. To make my points clear, I think it's important to understand both. Liberalism derives, among other things, from the theories of Immanuel Kant. These basically rest on the ideas of perpetual peace. The basic notion is that war is undesirable, and as a result, people seek peace. The idea of perpetual peace, therefore, comes from these premises and says that, world peace is possible. It's possible to move away from this cycle of war and conflict. Just to be clear here, I'm heavily summarizing for this video. Based on this central theory, liberalism has just outlined a few steps in order to be able to achieve this perpetual peace. For example, liberalism states that the world should be more democratic because democracies don't fight each other because they have to be accountable to their own population. Liberals also argue the importance of international institutions like the United Nations because it allows dialogue and multilateralism between countries, which prevents, again, conflict and war. Finally, this theory of international relations also argues, for example, for an increase in the amount of trade, because trade causes interdependency between countries. If you're trading with one country, then you don't have the incentive to declare war against them because that war would cause huge economic impact on your own country. I hope that through my explanation you've been able to notice that these theories align a lot with the observations that we can make about certain behaviors in the international system. If we take the assumption that Carney made, which is that we're moving from an old world order into a new one, then we can recognize that liberalism resembles a lot of this old world order, the rules-based order, as Carney puts it. This is characterized for a push for democratic regimes, strong international systems, as well as strong amounts of trade and commerce, something that is sometimes referred to in the media as globalism. So that's liberalism in a nutshell. But what about this other ideology I mentioned, realism? Well, I think a good starting off point to understand realism is that quote that Carney made from Thucydides, which is that the strong do as they will and the weak suffer as they must. That is the core belief system of realism. When Thucydides said this, he was talking about the Peloponnesian Wars during the 5th century BC, where during this time the Athenian forces came against the forces of Melos, and the Melos people refusing the ultimatum of the Athenians were therefore massacred by the Athenians. The strong do as they want, and the weak, the people of Melos, have to suffer as a result. While liberalism is based much on the works of Immanuel Kant, realism is based on the works of Hobbes, mainly his book, The Leviathan. In this book, Hobbes presents a world with no state, and in this world, the lack of state breeds anarchy and decadence among the people, because as Hobbes argues, humans are naturally self-interested. They seek power and survival, and as such, without a system to squash those desires and those beliefs, then they come out and we see this decadence without this state. Now, moving away from the conclusions that Hobbes makes about the presence of a strong state that ensures law and order, what's important to realism is that this is applied, therefore, to states. Realists argue that because there is no international government, international state, Therefore, states behave a lot like humans do in this world of Hobbes. Indeed, because states are made up of humans, state behaviors reflect human behaviors. So states are selfish, seeking power and survival. As a result, international relations is basically anarchic according to realists, and world politics looks a lot like power rivalries, as Mark Carney puts it in his speech. It isn't pretty or desirable, but for defenders of this ideology of realism, this is simply the reality we live in, hence the name realism. Anyways, this long-winded explanation is there to simply to show you that these two theories have been at odds with one another. Realists don't agree with liberals' view of perpetual peace because they believe that war is unavoidable, and as such peace cannot be achieved because states will always be in competition with one another. The popularity of these two theories have fluctuated over time and space. We see that liberalism has been quite popular since the end of the Cold War, since it was better able to explain the dynamics of world politics at the time, the rise of international institutions like the UN, which became very powerful. Meanwhile, realists were more popular during the Cold War because they were better able to explain the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and the proxy wars that ensued as a result. So what does this have to do with the topic which was presented at the beginning of the video? Well, my argument comes down to this. I believe that international relations is going much more into a realist approach that resembles a lot of the great power rivalries that we saw before World War I, the realist approach that we saw before the First World War. Don't believe me? Let's look at the concrete facts and parallels. In both periods, we see a world that is divided among multiple centers of power that is in competition with one another through economic and military rivalries. In both periods, we see the waning influence of traditional superpowers that are losing influence as a result of domestic issues. In our world, this is countries like France or the United Kingdom. In World War I, there was countries like the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In both periods, we see that despite this world being divided among multiple superpowers, there is one superpower that stands out by having economic supremacy with the world reserve currency, military bases all around the world, and the most powerful navy in the world. This great superpower has a tendency to get involved in foreign wars like in Afghanistan, Iran, or the Middle East in general. In the face of this hegemonic power, we see the rise of a new rival superpower that wants to establish its place in the world. It's only recently become a united country, but it has the ambition to rival the status quo. In our world, we have countries like China that believe it must recover from its century of humiliation during the 19th and 20th century and establish itself as the world's superpower, bringing back the status quo from before that period, before colonialism. To achieve this, we see in both periods, both powers developing a strong industry that's focused on exporting many different goods. They develop a very militaristic society and try and build a navy of their own that rivals the navy of the great superpower of the time, but not quite getting there yet. I hope you've started to observe these parallels as I have. Sure, they're not perfect, but we do see many similarities between these two periods. And this comparison isn't just some standalone moment that you can bring out as a fun fact. I believe it helps us understand the motivations of the countries, especially those nowadays in our current geopolitics. In June 2023, almost 3 years ago, TWZ, a newspaper specialized in defense policy, broke the story about a declassified naval intelligence briefing slide. This infographic presents the shipbuilding capacity of the US compared to that of China, and as you can see, it's a bit terrifying. It showed that in 2023, China had the shipbuilding capacity that was 230 times greater in volume than that of the US. While US shipyards could have the capacity of 100,000 tons, the Chinese had a capacity of 23.2 million tons. This was clearly a wake-up call for the defense community at large, and showed that what had once seemed as the impenetrable fortress of US naval dominance was at a very real risk of being dethroned. Already today, the Chinese Navy is larger than the US Navy in number of vessels. Sure, the US Navy is probably better in quality and would realistically win in a head-to-head conflict, but you also have to take into account that the US Navy is spread across multiple oceans, while the Chinese Navy only realistically has to worry about one ocean, maybe two. Then the numbers become very clear. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that the Chinese Navy is categorically better than the US Navy in any regard. These are based on projections, and it's very hard to calculate this level of who would win in a war between these two naval superpowers. And honestly, I don't have the expertise nor the time in this video to cover that. Your question might rightfully be then, What does this have to do with 1914? Well, back in the day, there was also a naval arms race between the two biggest superpowers of the time, Great Britain and the German Empire. Great Britain had established itself as the great naval superpower of the time since at least the Napoleonic Wars, just like the US had done after World War II. And for a while, no country had any navy that was even comparable to it. However, in the German Empire, with Kaiser Wilhelm II, he was obsessed with the idea of building a navy that was better and stronger than that of the British. And so that's exactly what he did. Although this initially didn't worry the British, by 1904, the possibility of the Germans overtaking the Britain in terms of naval supremacy was very much real. While Britain had its navy spread out across the entire world to cover all of its colonies and its trade interests, the German Empire only really had to focus its navy in one area, the North Sea. I mean, the parallel is clear here, but what I think is most interesting to me is how the British reacted as a result. The British government that same year decided to appoint John Fisher, nicknamed Jackie Fisher, as the First Lord of the Sea, basically the head of the Royal Navy. Jackie was, let's put it this way, he said things that weren't very popular. He immediately began by implementing radical reforms to the Royal Navy, notably selling off 90 obsolete ships despite public backlash. He in fact called them a miser's hoard of useless junk. A miser, if you don't know, is someone who keeps money, who's very greedy, who doesn't ever spend money at all. He also said they were too weak to fight and too slow to run away. Anyways, beyond this, Fisher also began to pull out a lot of the naval forces from around the world in all of Britain's colonies in order to concentrate the navy around the defence of the home island, where its immediate threat was. In this, we see a shift in UK geopolitical strategies, focusing away from its goals of the 19th century, which had been to protect its colonial empire, and instead focusing on the immediate threat at hand. Fisher also had much more radical ideas that weren't implemented, including proposing to the king at the time, Edward VII, to take the temporary superiority that the British had over the Germans, to take the British Navy down to German ports and Copenhagen it. For anyone unaware, Copenhagen refers to a time where Denmark was neutral during the Napoleonic Wars, and the British, not being very happy with this, decided to take their navy down to Copenhagen and basically blow up the Danish navy without any form of declaration of war or prior warning. Fisher was effectively saying we should take the British navy, take it down to Germany, and without declaring war, blow up the German navy so that they're unable to fight us at any time in the immediate future. A Pearl Harbor before its time. This proposition was soundly rejected, but it does give you an idea of who Fisher was and who he can be paralleled to in modern geopolitics. I mean, modern US foreign policy does reflect a lot of those old British defense policies. We see a shift in geopolitics. We see both forces re-evaluating their presence around the world, deciding to concentrate over certain areas over others, and abandoning old allies, traditional allies that it considers to be obsolete. We also see a man in charge who doesn't really like to listen to criticism and decides to go ahead anyways with his plan, usually involving wild ideas about single strikes and in and out operations that have minimal casualties. Honestly, when I started writing this video, I was surprised with all of the similarities I could point out between these two different periods. However, I do want to reiterate, I'm not trying to point out these standalone facts and say what happened in 1914 is going to happen again and World War III is just around the corner. We have to note that since then, technology has changed, economics and trade has changed, and the geography, the countries involved has changed dramatically. And as a result, this is likely to change how things are going. However, I do think this parallel is important because it allows us to understand the motivations of the states and specifically the world leaders of these two periods and make us a better understanding of our geopolitical world. I'm also not trying to push an ideological message trying to defend US policy or attack it. Whether you agree with US foreign policy or not currently is your business, not mine. I do believe it's important to understand the motivations behind these policies before making up your mind on it. And hopefully this video has helped you to do that, to discover maybe a new perspective on this, or maybe to double down on your opinion and decide that actually what you had previously you agree with even more because of what I've said in this video. So what's the answer to solving world peace? I don't know. Maybe realists are right. Maybe it's impossible. Maybe war is inevitable. But at least now you know the context.